The Grand Concert Hall in Berlin was buzzing with excitement. Camera crews adjusted their equipment while makeup artists put finishing touches on their clients. Tonight's live television show was special. They were interviewing one of the most famous conductors in the world, someone whose name alone could fill any concert hall in Europe. Heinrich Zimmermann walked into the studio like he owned the place. At 62 years old, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life being told he was extraordinary. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his black suit was tailored to perfection. When Heinrich entered a room, conversation stopped. People turned to look. This was a man who had conducted the world's greatest orchestras, who had made classical music history countless times. The producer rushed over to greet him. "Maestro Zimmermann, thank you for being here tonight. We have millions of viewers waiting to hear from you." Heinrich barely nodded. He wasn't here to make friends. He was here because his latest concert series needed publicity, and this television appearance would remind the world why he was considered the best conductor of his generation. His reputation had been built over 30 years of perfect performances, demanding standards and an unwillingness to accept anything less than excellence. "Where should I sit?" Heinrich asked, looking around the studio with the same critical eye he used when examining an orchestra before a performance. "Right here, Maestro. The interview will begin in 10 minutes. Heinrich settled into the elegant chair positioned next to the host's desk. The studio was impressive, with its warm lighting and expensive decorations, but he had seen better. He had performed in the most prestigious venues across Europe. This was just another day at work for him. What Heinrich didn't know was that across the world, in a small apartment in Tokyo, two young people were watching the same show he was about to appear on. They had been fans of his work for years, studying his conducting style, learning from his interpretations of classical masterpieces. Akira and Yuki Tanaka were 19 years old, twins who had been playing piano since they could barely reach the keys. Their apartment was tiny by most standards, but it contained something precious. An old upright piano that their grandmother had saved money for years to buy. The walls were covered with sheet music, concert posters, and photos of their musical heroes. Heinrich Zimmermann's picture held a place of honor among them. "Look, they're about to start the interview," Yuki whispered to her brother, even though they were alone in the apartment. She had always been the more talkative of the twins, the one who dreamed out loud about performing on the world's biggest stages. Akira adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He was quieter than his sister, more serious, but just as passionate about music. "I still can't believe we're going to be on the same show," he said softly. The twins had received the most incredible news of their lives just 3 days earlier. A television producer had discovered a video of them playing online. The video showed them performing an incredibly difficult piece by Chopin, their 4 hands moving across the piano keys like they were having a conversation only they could understand. The video had gotten thousands of views, and somehow it had reached the right person. The producer had called their small music school in Tokyo. At first, their teacher thought it was a prank. Young musicians from Japan didn't get invited to appear on European television shows. But the invitation was real. They had been flown to Berlin and put up in a modest hotel. Tomorrow they would appear as surprise guests on the same show featuring their musical hero. Neither of the twins had slept much the night before. They had practiced until their fingers were sore, going over the pieces they might be asked to play. They wanted everything to be perfect. This was their chance to show the world what they could do, their opportunity to prove that musical talent had no borders. Back in the television studio, the show's host was reviewing his notes one final time. David Chen had been hosting this cultural program for 5 years, and he prided himself on creating meaningful conversations about art and music. Tonight felt special. He had interviewed many famous musicians, but having Heinrich Zimmermann on the show was a career highlight. What made tonight even more exciting was the surprise he had planned. The young Japanese twins had impressed him so much during their brief rehearsal that morning. Their story was exactly what his audience loved. Young talent overcoming obstacles, pursuing dreams against all odds. He was confident that their appearance would make for great television. 30 seconds to air, called out the floor manager. Heinrich straightened his tie and put on his television smile. He had done hundreds of interviews over the years. He knew exactly what questions would be asked and had his answers ready. He would talk about his upcoming concert series, perhaps share a few insights about classical music, and remind everyone why his interpretations were considered definitive. The red light on the main camera turned on. "Good evening and welcome to Cultural Spotlight," David began, his voice warm and professional. "Tonight we have the extraordinary privilege of speaking with Maestro Heinrich Zimmermann, one of the world's most celebrated conductors." Heinrich nodded graciously as the camera focused on him. "Thank you for having me, David. It's always a pleasure to discuss the beauty of classical music. Maestro, your new concert series is being called a masterpiece of programming. Can you tell us what inspired your selections?" This was exactly the kind of question Heinrich had expected. He launched into a detailed explanation of his artistic vision, speaking about the careful balance between familiar masterworks and lesser-known gems. His voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades studying every note of the pieces he conducted. In their hotel room, the twins watched nervously. They would be called to the studio soon, but first they wanted to see their hero in action. Heinrich spoke beautifully about music, using words that painted pictures of the emotions and stories hidden within classical compositions. "He's incredible," Yuki whispered. "Listen to how he describes Beethoven's symphonies." Akira nodded, taking mental notes. This was how professionals talked about music. This was the level of understanding they aspired to reach. Heinrich continued, his interview growing more comfortable as he discussed his passion. "Classical music requires more than technical skill," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It demands cultural understanding, a connection to the traditions that have shaped this art form for centuries. When I conduct a piece by Mozart or Brahms, I'm not just reading notes on a page. I'm channeling hundreds of years of European musical heritage." The host nodded thoughtfully. "That's a fascinating perspective, Maestro. Speaking of different approaches to classical music, we actually have a wonderful surprise for you and our viewers tonight." Heinrich's smile faltered slightly. He didn't like surprises, especially not during live television interviews. Surprises meant loss of control, and control was something Heinrich valued above almost everything else. "We have two extraordinary young musicians joining us tonight," David continued, his excitement clearly genuine. "Twins from Japan who have taken the classical music world by storm with their incredible talent and unique interpretations." Heinrich's expression remained polite, but inside he felt a surge of irritation. This wasn't what he had agreed to. His interview was supposed to be about his work, his achievements, his upcoming concerts. Adding other performers felt like a distraction, a dilution of the serious musical discussion he had come here to have. "I see," Heinrich said carefully, maintaining his professional demeanor even as his mood darkened. David didn't notice the subtle change in the maestro's tone. He was too excited about the surprise he had planned. They'll be joining us shortly to demonstrate their remarkable skills. I think you'll be amazed by what these young artists can do. As the show went to a commercial, "Break!" Heinrich turned to the host with a forced smile. "I wasn't informed that other musicians would be performing tonight. I wanted it to be a surprise," David explained enthusiastically. "Wait until you hear them play. Their story is incredible. They learned classical music by watching videos online, practicing on an old piano in their tiny apartment. And now here they are, ready to perform on international television." Heinrich nodded politely, but his mind was racing. He had built his reputation on maintaining the highest standards of classical music. The idea that some young amateurs, no matter how enthusiastic, would be sharing his stage felt inappropriate. Classical music wasn't a game or a feel-good story for television. It was a serious art form that demanded respect, training, and deep cultural understanding. The commercial break ended, and the cameras rolled again. Heinrich put his professional smile back on, but something had changed. The warmth in his eyes had cooled, and his posture had become slightly more rigid. What had started as a pleasant evening was about to become something very different. In just a few minutes, two young dreamers would walk into that studio, excited to meet their hero and share their love of music with the world. They had no idea that their musical idol was already forming opinions about them, judgments based not on their talent, but on assumptions about who had the right to call themselves true classical musicians. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change all their lives forever. The studio doors opened quietly, and two young figures stepped inside. Akira and Yuki had changed into their best clothes for this moment. Akira wore a simple black suit that was slightly too big for his thin frame, while Yuki had chosen a modest, dark blue dress that their mother had bought specially for important occasions. They both looked nervous, but excited, their eyes wide as they took in the bright lights and cameras. David Chen noticed them first and smiled warmly. During the commercial break, he gestured for them to come closer to the interview area. "Maestro Zimmerman," he said, "I'd like you to meet Akira and Yuki Tanaka." Heinrich turned in his chair to look at the newcomers. His first impression was exactly what he had expected. Two very young, obviously inexperienced people who looked completely out of place in a serious television studio. They were polite, bowing slightly in the traditional Japanese manner, but Heinrich saw this as confirmation of his suspicions. These weren't serious classical musicians. They were just young people who had probably learned a few pieces and gotten lucky with some internet attention. "It's such an honor to meet you, Maestro," Yuki said softly, her English careful but clear. "We've studied your recordings for years. Your interpretation of Mahler's symphonies is incredible." Akira nodded enthusiastically. "Your conducting of, the Vienna Philharmonic last year was amazing. We watched it online probably 20 times. Heinrich offered a thin smile and a brief nod. He didn't respond to their compliments. In his mind, their admiration meant little. Anyone could watch performances online and claim to understand them. True appreciation of classical music came from years of proper training, cultural immersion, and deep study of European musical traditions. "And we're back," David announced as the cameras started rolling again. "I'm here with the renowned maestro, Heinrich Zimmerman, and we've just been joined by two extraordinary young musicians from Tokyo, Akira and Yuki Tanaka." The twins sat in the chairs that had been prepared for them, looking small under the bright studio lights. They kept glancing at Heinrich with obvious admiration, completely unaware of his growing disapproval. Now, Akira and Yuki, David continued, your story is remarkable. You taught yourselves classical piano by watching videos online, is that correct? Well, not exactly, Yuki replied, always the more talkative twin. We had some basic lessons when we were very young, but we couldn't afford formal training. So yes, we learned most of what we know from watching performances online and practicing on our grandmother's old piano. David nodded encouragingly. And now you're here in Berlin, about to perform on international television. How does that feel? Like a dream, Akira said quietly. We never imagined we'd get to meet Maestro Zimmermann, let alone be on the same show. Heinrich's jaw tightened almost, imperceptibly. The more he heard about their background, the more convinced he became that this was exactly the kind of amateur hour nonsense that was damaging classical music's reputation. Self-taught musicians who learned from internet videos? It was insulting to everyone who had dedicated their lives to proper musical education. Maestro, David said, turning back to Heinrich, what do you think about the democratization of classical music education through technology? These young people represent a new generation that's finding ways to access classical music despite traditional barriers. This was the opening Heinrich had been waiting for, though not in the way David intended. The question gave him the perfect opportunity to express his views about what was happening to classical music standards. Well, David, Heinrich began, his voice measured but carrying an edge that the twins didn't immediately recognize. I think we need to be very careful about what we mean when we use words like classical musician. The studio grew quiet. Something in Heinrich's tone had shifted, and even David sensed that the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Classical music isn't just about playing notes correctly, Heinrich continued, his gaze shifting to the twins. It's about understanding, centuries of cultural tradition, about grasping the historical context in which these masterpieces were created. It requires immersion in European culture, in the languages and societies that gave birth to this art form. Yuki shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She could feel that something was wrong, but she wasn't sure what. Now, I'm sure these young people are very dedicated, Heinrich went on, his tone becoming more condescending with each word. And I'm certain they can play some pieces with technical accuracy. But technical ability isn't the same as true musical understanding. David tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But surely talent can emerge from anywhere, Maestro. Music is a universal language after all. Heinrich's smile was cold. Is it, though? I've spent 40 years studying the works of Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms. I've lived in Vienna, studied in Salzburg, conducted in the very halls where these composers premiered their works. Classical music grows from European soil, David. It's rooted in our history, our culture, our way of understanding the world. The twins were beginning to understand what was happening. The man they had admired from afar, whose recordings they had treasured, was essentially telling them they didn't belong in his world. I'm not saying these young people can't play piano, Heinrich continued, now looking directly at Akira and Yuki. But there's a difference between mechanical reproduction and true artistic interpretation. Can someone who learned from internet videos really understand what Chopin was feeling when he composed his ballades? Can they grasp the cultural weight of a Beethoven sonata without having lived and breathed in the European tradition that created it? The studio audience was becoming uncomfortable. What had started as a celebration of young talent was turning into something much darker. David kept trying to interrupt, but Heinrich was on a roll now, years of frustration with what he saw as the dumbing down of classical music pouring out. Perhaps, Heinrich said, his voice dripping with false kindness, these young people would be better served by focusing on their own musical traditions. Japan has a rich musical heritage of its own. Why try to imitate something they can never truly understand when they could excel at music that actually belongs to their culture? The words hit the twins like physical blows. Yuki felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she fought them back. Akira's hands clenched into fists in his lap, his face burning with humiliation and anger. "Maestro," David said, his voice strained, as he tried to salvage the interview. "I think you might be underestimating—" "Am I?" Heinrich interrupted. "Look, I have nothing against enthusiasm, but we're talking about the greatest musical tradition in human history. We're discussing works that represent the pinnacle of artistic achievement. These masterpieces deserve more than amateur appreciation, no matter how well-intentioned." The cameras kept rolling, broadcasting this humiliation to millions of viewers around the world. In their small apartment in Tokyo, the twins' parents watched in horror as their children were being torn down on international television by the very man they had looked up to. "I've heard this kind of thing before," Heinrich continued, seemingly oblivious to the damage he was causing. "Young people who think that passion alone is enough, who believe that a few years of internet learning can replace decades of proper training and cultural immersion. It's admirable in a way, but it's also naive." Yuki found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Maestro Zimmermann, we've studied classical music our entire lives. We may not have had formal European training, but we understand these pieces. We feel them." Heinrich's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "You feel them? My dear, feeling is not enough. Understanding Chopin requires understanding 19th century Poland. Appreciating Mozart means grasping 18th century Austrian society. These aren't just pretty melodies to be copied from YouTube videos." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the camera operators looked uncomfortable. This wasn't the uplifting, cultural exchange that everyone had expected. "I suppose," Heinrich continued, delivering what he clearly thought would be his final point, "that we live in an age where everyone thinks they can be anything they want to be, regardless of background or proper preparation. But classical music isn't democratic, David. It's an aristocracy of skill, training, and cultural understanding. You can't just decide to join it because you have nimble fingers and access to the internet." Akira looked at his sister, seeing the pain in her eyes. All their dreams, all their years of practice, all their hopes for this moment. Everything was being destroyed by the very person they had most wanted to impress. David made one more attempt to save the interview. "Well, perhaps we could hear the twins play something? Let the music speak for itself?" Heinrich waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure they can play something. As I said, technical ability isn't the issue, but there's no point in demonstrating mechanical reproduction when what we should be discussing is true artistry." The twins sat there, crushed and humiliated as millions of viewers witnessed their public destruction. They had traveled halfway around the world to meet their hero, only to discover that their hero saw them as nothing more than pretenders, cultural tourists trying to play in a world where they would never belong. The interview continued for a few more painful minutes, but the damage was done. Two young dreamers had just learned that their musical idol considered them unworthy of the very art form they loved most in the world. For several long moments, the studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. The twins sat frozen in their chairs, still processing the devastating words they had just heard. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of their humiliation. David Chen looked between his guests, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage what had become a disaster of an interview. Heinrich, meanwhile, seemed satisfied with himself. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed he had just delivered an important lesson about maintaining standards in classical music. In his mind, he had done the twins a favor by giving them a reality check before they wasted more time pursuing something beyond their reach. The studio audience shifted nervously in their seats. Many of them had children of their own, and watching. Two young people being crushed so publicly felt deeply wrong. But this was live television, and there was no way to undo what had just happened. Yuki wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. She looked at her brother, and something passed between them in that silent way that only twins can communicate. They had always been each other's strength, especially in the hardest moments. Growing up without much money, facing skepticism from teachers who thought classical music was too expensive for families like theirs, they had learned to rely on each other. Akira straightened in his chair. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by something else. Not anger exactly, but a quiet determination that his sister recognized immediately. She had seen that look before, usually right before he did something that surprised everyone. "Excuse me, Maestro Zimmerman?" Akira said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly through the studio. Heinrich turned toward him with mild interest, probably expecting an apology or maybe a tearful exit. "Yes? You mentioned that classical music requires more than technical ability," Akira continued, his English becoming more confident with each word. "You said it demands true understanding and cultural connection." "That's correct," Heinrich replied, wondering where this was going. "I agree with you completely," Akira said, and this response clearly surprised the maestro. "Technical skill without musical understanding is just noise. Anyone can learn to press keys in the right order. But to really play classical music, you need to feel what the composer felt, understand what they were trying to express." Heinrich nodded cautiously. Perhaps the boy was finally grasping the lesson he had been trying to teach. "So, I have a question for you," Akira continued, standing up slowly from his chair. "Since you believe so strongly in the importance of true musical understanding over mere technical ability, would you be willing to demonstrate this for us?" The studio grew even quieter. David leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Heinrich asked, his tone becoming slightly defensive. Yuki stood up beside her brother, understanding immediately what he had in mind. Despite everything that had just happened, she couldn't help but smile slightly. This was why she loved her twin brother. Just when everyone expected him to give up, he found a way to fight back. "Well," Akira said, his voice growing stronger, "there's a beautiful grand piano right here in the studio. And you've just explained to millions of viewers that classical music is about much more than technical ability. So perhaps you could show us what true artistic interpretation looks like." Heinrich felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach. "I'm a conductor, young man. My expertise is in leading orchestras, not in solo piano performance." "Of course," Akira replied politely. "But surely someone with your deep understanding of classical music, someone who has spent 40 years studying the great masters, could demonstrate the kind of cultural connection and artistic interpretation that you say is so important." The trap was beautifully set, and Heinrich was beginning to realize it. In front of a live television audience, in front of millions of viewers, he was being challenged to back up his harsh words with actual performance. Refusing would make him look cowardly, but accepting might be even worse. "I think that's a wonderful idea, David said enthusiastically, sensing that the interview was about to take a dramatic turn. "Maestro, would you honor us with a performance?" Heinrich looked around the studio, feeling cornered. His entire reputation was built on his authority, his expertise, his right to judge others. But that authority had always been exercised from the conductor's podium, leading orchestras, interpreting compositions through other musicians. His own piano skills, once decent, had grown rusty over the years of focusing on conducting. "What piece did you have in mind?" Heinrich asked, trying to buy himself some time to think. Yuki stepped forward, her voice sweet, but carrying an edge that only someone paying close attention would notice. "Oh, we wouldn't presume to choose for someone of your expertise, Maestro. Perhaps something that really showcases the kind of cultural understanding and artistic depth that you've been talking about." The audience was now completely engaged. The uncomfortable tension from earlier had transformed into anticipation. Everyone could sense that they were witnessing something important, though they weren't sure exactly what. Heinrich's mind raced through possibilities. He needed something impressive enough to maintain his credibility, but not so difficult that he would humiliate himself. His piano technique had never been his strongest skill, even in his younger days. "Perhaps," he said, carefully, "something by Chopin? Since you mentioned his ballads earlier." Akira shook his head gently. "Actually, if you don't mind, there's a piece that would really demonstrate the kind of technical mastery combined with artistic understanding that you've been discussing. It's Liszt's La Campanella." The effect of these words on the musicians in the studio audience was immediate. Several people audibly gasped. La Campanella wasn't just a difficult piece. It was one of the most technically demanding compositions in the entire piano repertoire. Even professional concert pianists approached it with respect and trepidation. Heinrich felt his heart sink. La Campanella required not just cultural understanding, but extraordinary technical skill, lightning-fast octave passages, and the kind of finger dexterity that took years of dedicated practice to maintain. It was exactly the type of piece that would expose any weakness in a pianist's technique. "That's quite an ambitious suggestion," Heinrich said, trying to maintain his composure. "Oh, but Maestro," Yuki said with perfect innocence. "You've just finished explaining that technical difficulty isn't really the issue. You said that what matters is true artistic interpretation and cultural understanding. Surely someone with your deep knowledge of Liszt's work would be able to convey the emotional content of the piece, regardless of any minor technical challenges?" Heinrich realized he was trapped. His own words were being used against him. He had just spent 10 minutes telling millions of viewers that technique was secondary to understanding, that proper cultural immersion was more important than mere finger exercises. Now he was being asked to prove it. "Besides," Akira added quietly, "La Campanella is such a beautiful piece. The way Liszt captures the sound of little bells, the playfulness mixed with underlying melancholy. Someone with your background in European musical tradition would surely be able to bring out all those layers of meaning." David was practically vibrating with excitement. This was turning into the kind of television moment that people would remember for years. "What do you say, Maestro? Will you share your interpretation of La Campanella with us?" Heinrich looked at the piano, then at the cameras, then at the two young people who had somehow managed to turn his own attack against him. Refusing now would be admitting that his harsh words about technical skill being secondary were hollow. But attempting the piece— "Very well," he said finally, his voice tight. Though I should mention that this piano may not be properly tuned for such a demanding piece. It was a weak excuse, and everyone knew it. Professional studios maintained their instruments carefully, but Heinrich was already preparing his exit strategy, laying the groundwork for explanations if things went badly. He walked slowly to the grand piano, feeling the weight of every step. The studio was completely silent, now everyone holding their breath. Heinrich sat down at the bench, adjusted it slightly, and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment he just sat there, trying to remember the opening passages of a piece he hadn't played in years. La Campanella had been in his repertoire as a young man, but that was decades ago. Conducting had consumed his life, leaving little time for maintaining his solo piano skills. He began to play. The opening went well enough. Heinrich's musical knowledge was genuine, and he understood the structure of the piece. But as the composition progressed toward its first technically challenging passage, cracks began to appear in his performance. His fingers, accustomed to holding a conductor's baton rather than navigating complex piano passages, began to stumble. The lightning-fast octave runs that make La Campanella famous became muddy and unclear. His timing, once precise, started to waver. The studio audience watched in growing discomfort as one of the world's most famous conductors struggled with a piece he had claimed would be simple for someone with proper cultural understanding. Heinrich's face grew red with effort and embarrassment as his fingers betrayed him again and again. Finally, about halfway through the piece, he stopped playing. The silence that followed was devastating. "I'm afraid," Heinrich said, his voice strained, "that this piano really isn't properly tuned for this particular composition. The action feels sluggish." Nobody believed him. The excuse was too obvious, too desperate. Heinrich had just demonstrated exactly what he had accused the twins of lacking. His technique wasn't sufficient for his ambitions. Akira and Yuki stood quietly beside the piano, saying nothing. They didn't need to gloat or make cutting remarks. The music itself had spoken louder than any words could. The silence in the studio stretched on for what felt like forever. Heinrich sat at the piano bench, his hands frozen above the keys, trying to process what had just happened to him. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and tiny beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool studio air. The man who had just humiliated two young musicians on live television had been exposed in the most devastating way possible. David Chen cleared his throat gently, unsure how to handle the situation. The cameras were still rolling, broadcasting this uncomfortable moment to millions of viewers around the world. He had hosted thousands of interviews, but nothing had prepared him for this. Heinrich slowly stood up from the piano bench, his movements stiff and awkward. "As I said," he muttered, "the instrument isn't properly maintained for such demanding repertoire." But his voice lacked conviction. Everyone in the studio knew that the piano wasn't the problem. Akira and Yuki remained standing quietly beside the piano. They hadn't moved during Heinrich's failed performance, hadn't whispered to each other, or shown any signs of satisfaction. They simply waited, their faces calm and respectful, as if what had just happened was the most natural thing in the world. "Perhaps," Yuki said softly, her voice barely audible in the hushed studio, "we could try the piano ourselves, just to see if it's really having technical problems?" The suggestion was made with such gentle politeness that it took a moment for everyone to understand what she was really offering. This wasn't just about testing the piano. This was about proving a point that had been building for the entire evening. Heinrich turned to look at the twins, and for the first time since they had entered the studio, he really saw them. Not as intruders or amateurs, but as two young people who had just witnessed him fail at the very thing he had claimed they could never understand. His authority, his credibility, everything he had built his reputation on was crumbling in real time. I suppose that would be acceptable, he said quietly, stepping away from the piano. David seized the opportunity. What a wonderful idea! Let's see what Akira and Yuki can do with this piece. The twins approached the piano together, and something interesting happened. Instead of one of them sitting down at the bench, they both remained standing. Yuki moved to the left side of the keyboard, while Akira positioned himself on the right. What are you doing? Heinrich asked, genuinely confused. We're going to play La Campanella, Akira replied simply. But we're going to play it the way we learned it. Together. A murmur went through the studio audience. Playing La Campanella as a duet was virtually unheard of. The piece was designed for a single pianist, and its incredible technical demands were meant to showcase one person's skill. Attempting to coordinate two players on such a complex composition seemed impossible. That's not how the piece is written, Heinrich protested weakly. You're absolutely right, Yuki agreed. Liszt wrote it for one pianist. But when we were learning it from online videos, we only had one old upright piano in our tiny apartment. We had to take turns practicing or find ways to practice together, so we created our own arrangement. We've been playing together for so long, Akira added, that sometimes it feels like we share the same musical mind. When one of us thinks a phrase, the other already knows how it should sound. Heinrich watched in bewilderment as the twins made final adjustments to their positions. This wasn't at all what he had expected. He had assumed they would attempt a traditional performance, probably stumble through it reasonably well, and that would be the end of the evening's drama. But this was something entirely different. Whenever you're ready, David said, his voice tight with anticipation. The twins looked at each other for just a moment, and in that glance, they communicated everything they needed to know. Then Yuki placed her hands on the lower keys while Akira positioned his fingers over the higher register, and they began to play. What happened next was unlike anything anyone in that studio had ever witnessed. The opening notes of La Campanella filled the air, but they weren't just notes anymore. They were a conversation between two minds that understood each other perfectly, two sets of hands that moved as if controlled by a single consciousness. The technical passages that had defeated Heinrich flowed effortlessly under their fingers. But more than that, their performance revealed layers of the composition that even experienced listeners had never noticed before. When Yuki played the lower melody lines, Akira's higher notes seemed to dance around them like actual bells, creating the illusion that inspired the piece's name. Heinrich stood frozen, watching something that shouldn't have been possible. The twins weren't just playing the notes correctly, they were playing them with an understanding and sensitivity that went far beyond their years. Every phrase was shaped with musical intelligence. Every dynamic change was perfectly coordinated between their four hands. The studio audience began to lean forward in their seats. Even the camera operators, who had seen countless performances over the years, found themselves drawn into the music. This wasn't just a performance. It was a masterclass in musical communication. As the piece progressed toward its most challenging sections, the twins' playing became even more remarkable. Passages that typically required incredible stretches for a single pianist were divided seamlessly between them, creating textures and colors that the original version couldn't achieve. They weren't just adapting the piece, they were reimagining Heinrich felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine musical surprise. These two young people weren't just competent, they were extraordinary. But what struck him most wasn't their technical ability, impressive as it was. It was the depth of their musical understanding, the very quality he had claimed they could never possess. In their performance, he could hear everything he had said was missing from their approach to classical music. They understood Liszt's playfulness, his melancholy, his brilliant balance between technical showmanship and emotional depth. They captured the Hungarian influences in the composer's style, the way he transformed simple melodies into complex musical conversations. Most importantly, they played with joy. Despite everything Heinrich had said to them, despite the humiliation they had endured, their love for the music came through in every note. This wasn't mechanical reproduction or cultural imitation. This was two young artists sharing their genuine passion with the world. The twins navigated the piece's notorious difficulty with such ease that it almost looked simple. Their hands moved in perfect coordination, never interfering with each other, each player instinctively knowing when to lead and when to follow. It was like watching a dance performed by people who had been partners their entire lives. As they approached the final section, something magical happened. The studio's acoustics seemed to transform the piano into an entire orchestra of bells, exactly as Liszt had intended. The twins played with such precision and musical intelligence that the instrument itself seemed to come alive under their touch. When the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was completely different from the uncomfortable quiet that had marked Heinrich's failed performance. This silence was full of wonder, of people trying to process what they had just witnessed. Then, the applause began. It started with one person in the studio audience, then spread quickly until the entire room was erupting in appreciation. The camera operators, the sound technicians, even the usually reserved David Chen were clapping enthusiastically. Heinrich remained motionless, staring at the twins who had just destroyed every assumption he had made about them. They stood beside the piano, slightly out of breath from their performance, looking modest and surprised by the response they were receiving. "That was," David began, then stopped, seemingly unable to find adequate words. "That was absolutely incredible." The twins bowed politely, the same respectful gesture they had made when first meeting Heinrich. But now that gesture carried different weight. They weren't bowing out of nervousness or hero worship. They were acknowledging the audience's appreciation with the grace of true professionals. Heinrich slowly walked toward them, his steps uncertain. When he reached the piano, he stopped and looked at both twins for a long moment. The studio fell. Quiet again, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. "I owe you both an apology," Heinrich said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What you just played, what you just shared with us, it was extraordinary. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything I said." Yuki looked at her. "Brother," then back at Heinrich. "Thank you for saying that, Maestro. But you don't need to apologize. Music speaks for itself, doesn't it?" Heinrich nodded slowly, recognizing his own earlier words being returned to him with far more kindness than he deserved. "Yes," he said quietly. "It certainly does." The interview concluded shortly after that, but the impact of what had happened spread far beyond that television studio. Videos of the twins' performance went viral within hours, shared by millions of people who recognized they had witnessed something special. Music schools around the world began discussing the evening's events, and classical music critics wrote thoughtful pieces about talent, prejudice, and the universal language of great performance. 6 months later, Akira and Yuki performed as featured soloists with the Vienna Philharmonic, fulfilling the dream that had brought them to that Berlin television studio. In the audience that night sat Heinrich Zimmermann, who had specifically requested tickets to hear them play. He listened with the humility of someone who had learned that true musical greatness recognizes no borders, speaks all languages, and can emerge from anywhere in the world where passion meets dedication. The music, as always, had taught them all the most important lesson of all: